The information found in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hi, and welcome to the Women in Depth podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lourdes Viado. Join me as we explore the inner lives of women, their struggles, fears, hopes, and dreams. We'll go beneath the surface and take a deeper look at what is hidden, unknown, uncertain, and uncomfortable. Hi, and welcome back to the podcast. In honor of Valentine's Day, I'm really excited to share that we're able to welcome back a recent guest, Dr. Stacey Shelby, who spoke to us about the wild woman archetype for Women in Depth's 100th episode. And today she has graciously agreed to come back and talk to us about a topic that anyone in relationship, anyone who has been in love or wants to be in love, has experienced the throes of the first stages of love. So basically, I think that would be all of us. Dr. Stacey Shelby is going to be talking to us about the psychology of romantic love. Dr. Stacey Shelby is an author, speaker, educator, and depth psychotherapist. She's a registered clinical counselor in Canada, a certified clinical dream tender, and she has studied in shamanic and yoga traditions. She is adjunct faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara, California, and she holds a master's and Ph.D. in depth psychology with a specialization in Jungian and Archetypal Studies. Dr. Shelby has a thriving clinical practice in Squamish, British Columbia, where she works with adults in various stages of personal transformation in person and via internet. She is gifted at working with the symbolic language of the soul, and she is dedicated to honoring the soul as it presents in the lived experience of daily life. Hi, Stacey, and welcome back.
Hi, Lourdes. Thank you so much for having me back.
Oh, I'm very excited, and I know that our listeners are really going to be also excited about this topic, and I think it's a topic that, regardless of whether it's Valentine's Day or not, is at the foremost of a lot of people's attention.
I would certainly agree with that. Certainly relationships, generally speaking, relationships and vocation are the two areas that people seem to come to clinical therapy for because they're struggling the most. And romantic relationship, above all other forms of relationship, seems to be where the deepest and most intense struggle presents itself. And of course, Valentine's Day is around the myth of Eros and Psyche. Eros, who we now have as a little baby in a diaper with a kind of toy bow and arrow, but in the Greek and Roman mythology was actually one of the most potent and powerful gods, the god of love.
And so we also, just for our listeners, they may also think of Eros or know Eros as Cupid, right? Would that be correct?
Yes, that is correct. The modern day languages, we call him Cupid. So Eros, Amor, Cupid, these are all the same names to describe the same god.
So what drew you to this area of romantic love, teaching about it, writing about it?
Struggling with it. Really, that is the short answer. I was in my own throes of individuation that happens at midlife, and for me it was really showing up in the container of romantic love. I was going through a divorce. I was with my ex-partner for 10 years. And then a few years after that, I was in love with a man who was just not going to be available the way I wanted him to. And I couldn't understand it. And the struggle. And, that went on for 3 years. And so that was going on while I was at Pacifica doing my master's and PhD work. And, retrospectively, because I have, 6 or 7 years of hindsight at this point, which feels really great. I can look back and see that was like such a gift, even though at the time it was so hard. But the gift was that it provided so much material that I had to transfer that material into something else. And it became my area of research because I was trying to sort out myself and this struggle with romantic love at the time. So that was probably where formally and professionally I got really interested in the area of romantic love. So that was a very big part. In fact, it's probably a full quarter of the book, Tracking the Wild Woman Archetype. And it was really grounded in the struggles of relationship as the catalyst for transformational growth. And so because of that has now led to being a bit of an area of interest. And now I'll be teaching the course. The course is so appropriately named Eros and Psyche, the Psychology of Romantic Love. I'll be teaching that at Pacifica starting this year in 2019. So that's exciting as well.
I bet you'll have a lot of students in that class.
It'll be a popular and vulnerable class for sure.
So to familiarize our listeners who perhaps are not very familiar with the mythology, could you share the mythology of Eros and Psyche to frame our conversation?
Yes. So the tale of Eros and Psyche is the tale of love and soul. Eros being the god of love, being the son of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty, and sexuality. Psyche is the human soul, and the story starts that she's born a mortal woman, and her beauty is so great that people start to admire her and start calling her the second Aphrodite, and maybe she's more beautiful than Aphrodite. And so people start revering Psyche. And so Aphrodite, being green-eyed with jealousy, takes this all very seriously and gets into a rage and orders her son to take the beautiful Psyche up onto a mountaintop and kill her. And so he does that. However, he takes her up there to kill her. However, he falls in love with her. And instead of killing her, Zephyr, the west wind, carries them away, and he keeps her hidden away in his bedchamber, making her swear to only gaze upon him at night so she can never see his true form. So then her sisters start telling Psyche they're allowed to visit her. They'll start telling Psyche that she's married to some hideous monster and some dragon, and she should be terrified, and oh, the deceit. And so she starts to believe them. And so she has this idea that she'll have while he's asleep, she takes a knife, Psyche's knife, and she takes oil lamp, and she shines the lamp upon Eros. And as she shines the lamp, she realizes she's fallen in love with the god of love himself. He's beautiful. And a drop of hot oil lands on him at the same time and wakes him. And being betrayed, he flees. So in this point in the story, this is where the beautiful love interest departs and is no longer available the way one hopes. At that point, she goes through a huge stage of mourning and grief and tries to figure out what to do until eventually she does what she has to do, which is go to Aphrodite, the mother, the goddess of love and beauty and sexuality, and pray for mercy. So Aphrodite, thinking that she'll condemn her to death, gives her 4 impossible tasks. And the first task is she gives her a pile of seeds and grains and orders her to have all these tiny little details sorted. And so by a certain time frame. And of course, Psyche realizes this is impossible. She falls down. She contemplates suicide. She weeps. It's hopeless. And then some ants come and take pity on her, and they come and gather all the insects, and they do the sorting for her. They sort out all these little details so the task gets accomplished. Aphrodite, in a rage, gives her the second task. She is to go and collect ram's fur from these very aggressive mountain sheep that represent a very intense form of masculinity, a very aggressive form of masculinity. So she can't go directly because they'll attack her. So she falls down and collapses and thinks, oh, I can't do this. I'll throw myself into the river. It's all terrible. And she gets whispered from the reeds in nature about how she can go at dusk when their eyesight is quite bad, and she can collect the fur that's been brushed off against the brambles and the bushes. And in doing so, she can accomplish the task. So she does this, and she manages to take the fur back to Aphrodite, and it's accomplished. Well, now Aphrodite's really in a knot, and she gives her a third impossible task. She sends her to the river Styx, which is the river of life and death, and orders her to collect a crystal goblet full of the water from the river Styx. So this river, it flows down into the depths of Hades and up into the heavens, and it's the whole rebirth cycle. And the steep slopes are rocky and dangerous, and there's dragons, and you can't get near it. She collapses again, contemplates suicide, weeps. Zeus takes pity on her at this point, and Zeus sends his golden eagle, and the golden eagle comes and takes the crystal goblet delicately, focuses with its special eagle vision, dips into the water, and completes the task, and brings it back to her, and Aphrodite returns it, or she returns it to Aphrodite. Then the fourth task, the journey to hell and back, the trip to Hades. She tells her she has to go to Hades, the underworld, and she has to collect a cask of Persephone's beauty ointment. And she thinks, well, that's impossible. She goes to the high tower and she contemplates throwing herself out the window and weeps. And the tower, so this time something that is not of nature, but something of culture, gives her the information that she has to go, gives her all these different little instructions about how to find the pathless path and take biscuits to distract the hounds of hell, the three-headed dog, and how to pay the ferryman, and not to take any pity or kindness or offer kindness to people along the way. So she goes on this journey, and she gets through all these different challenges. One of them, very significant for many women, is she has to say no to people. She has to stop being so kind. So she has to pass by a beggar who's dumped his beggar bowl. She has to pass by a drowning man who's, she's crossing the river Styx. She can't help him. She has to go by the three fates that turn the fates of time. They invite her, come spin with us. No, she has to go by. She distracts the three-headed dog. She meets Persephone. She can't engage in her hospitality or she would get stuck there too long. So she remains humble and modest. She asks for the cask of ointment. She's given her, Persephone gives it to her. And then she makes the same journey back, and she gets almost back to the upper world, and curiosity or something overtakes her, and she opens the cask of beauty ointment, which she's promised she wouldn't do. Aphrodite made her promise not to do this. And so she opens it, and she immediately falls unconscious. And as she falls unconscious, this apparently arouses Eros, who meanwhile is basically out of the myth. We believe he is probably in Aphrodite's castle doing her bidding. But when his beloved Psyche falls unconscious and into peril, he is aroused and he goes to her aid and he scoops her up, kisses her, she awakens, and she's able to complete the task. At that point, the myth wraps up quite quickly. Psyche is invited to marry Eros on the mountain of Olympus with all the gods and goddesses. Aphrodite attends and is full of merriment. And the story ends with Psyche, who has been impregnated through this whole of these tasks, gives birth to her child. And the child's name translates usually as pleasure. So after all this suffering, she gives birth to pleasure and becomes an immortal goddess herself.
Wow, that is quite a story. And I can begin to see some of the threads, the outlines of how this connects to the psychology of romantic love. So thank you so much for sharing the story, because I believe that the myth really is a big part of understanding what happens in this dynamic.
And it's so important to understand it symbolically because there's actually two processes, maybe three actually, going on here. One is the story describes outer stages of romantic love and relationship. You know, the blind love of the rush of falling in love, where she's kind of in her chamber, not really knowing anything about who he is. You know, we relate to that sweet, blissful state. And then the struggle as we start to like figure each other out and who each other is. And then on the other side of that is the promise of pleasure, right? So there's that external piece, but there's also perhaps a more important internal piece about how I think what we ultimately fall in love with is our own souls. So it's really an inward journey as well. And so then the question is really, how do we demonstrate and express love of soul through our being, through our existence, through our presence, outside of romantic love, but as an inner love, the conjunctio of the inner king and queen.
So the process of romantic love that many of us embark on, all of us, I think, hopefully we all would like to experience this.
Yes, I think it's a blessing.
It's actually an invitation of sorts to embark on an inner journey.
It's absolutely an invitation to embark on an inner journey. I don't know that much else can trigger us into the depths that romantic love does, because it activates so many complexes, all the jealousies and insecurities and the possessiveness and the I'm not good enough and I'm introverted and you're extroverted and I'm a planner and you're a go with the flower and all these differences. And so it causes us to really have to explore ourselves individually because we're in relation to somebody else who's showing up differently.
So, as you describe some of the, I guess, the outer stages or the external manifestations of romantic love, how do some of these correlate with the story? So, for example, the struggle and the heartache, and then the inevitable going separate ways. How does that correspond with the myth? And what's the inner process also that goes with that? So I guess I'm asking a really complex question, Stacey. Mm-hmm. So I guess those are the layers I'm looking at. What are some of the external struggles in the myth? How do we experience them potentially in our human relationships? And what does that correlate to on the inward journey?
In the simple answer to the hard question, and I'll do the harder answer first. What pops to mind is that, that movie structure of the romantic comedy of boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back, right?
It's right.
Like that is the lived experience. That is the psychological journey. That's the Eros and Psyche story. Although it's of course not that simple as it is in an hour and a half comedy.
Right.
So I think one of the ways that it really shows up, and to ground this in my lived experience that's also told in the book, the struggle I was in for 3 years with the fellow that I really wanted him to show up in a particular way, which was committed and monogamous and available, crazy stuff. Not his values, but just where he was at that time, actually. And so that particular struggle was the catalyst. And, I was in probably my second year of depth psychology studies. So I was not new to this world. And I had a very good therapist. And she really calmly, and I'd been seeing her a long time at this point, and she very calmly says, have you ever considered that perhaps he's a guide for you for your inner life and what that might be? I went, no. It's not a guide to my inner life. What are you talking about? He's just a man that won't commit. Which, is funny because retrospectively, he was absolutely a guide to my inner life and probably also a man who wouldn't commit. But it's because he wouldn't commit that he was a guide. And so what happens in those cases where we're really erotically charged in our attraction towards somebody, and that goes both directions, whether it's just in whatever direction, which somebody holds an erotic charge for us, if it's a heterosexual man towards a woman, or it's a bit more complex if it's homosexual preferences, but the process happens either way. We develop these inner guides that are known as animus, is the masculine expression, and anima is the feminine expression. And they get personified by a particular person in our real life, in the outer world, that we have a very strong erotic attraction to. And so where that person serves as a guide is they're showing us aspects of ourselves that we are probably as yet very unconscious of and maybe need to develop. So, for example, this man that I was attracted to, he's a very elite level athlete. He participated in 2 Olympics and had been to 3. So he was really at his most actualized performance. For me, that was still very, very much in shadow. I wasn't in my own arena, wasn't developing myself. I wasn't self-actualizing to the degree that I needed to be moving towards. So in that way, he was really showing me that potential. It also occurs to me, although it was a surprising number of years later, that he's an Olympian. And so I really had deified him. I really had made him this inner God archetype. And in the sense that I wasn't really getting to know the human person as authentically as I was also getting to know this inner animus figure for me. So he was mirroring back to me, but of course it wasn't quite aligned because he wasn't behaving the way my animus was behaving. And so there's all this conflict that goes on between the human experience and the inner experience.
And so for you, looking back on this lived experience, the actual struggle, this had to happen. This was necessary for you to self-actualize, to individuate.
Absolutely. In order to both develop my inner masculine and my inner feminine, I had to go through this struggle of being in relationship with this wonderful person. Like, God bless him, he was so patient with me. But then he was also projecting his stuff onto me as well, and he was growing tremendously too. So it's a necessary struggle in order to self-actualize, in order to become self-aware. But the important piece while all that's going on is to be very self-reflective, right? It's about how can I own this? What in this is mine? What in this is his? And trying to differentiate and sort out these pieces.
So what aspects of the myth would you say correspond with the struggle to hold on to, the struggle to control, the struggle to stay connected?
The struggle to stay connected. Well, I think that's what Psyche, soul, or a woman who's in love is, these tasks, these 4 tasks, they call her to her highest challenge. Like, she's right to the edge of suicide every time. And in human women, we really don't want to make the mistake of literalizing that, but understanding that symbolically of what is dying off is through the struggle is the naive young girl. She's becoming the queen. She's becoming the mature Psyche. She's no longer this naive innocent. She is self-aware through this process. So it is the struggle of pursuing love, soul pursuing what it loves, which is love, the God of love, that causes us to become a more whole, balanced version of ourselves, a conscious version of ourselves, or at least as conscious as we can be.
It's almost as if there's not a whole lot that would motivate you or push you to grow in this way and to go through this type of immense, difficulty and pain.
Oh, no, just no. There's not much that could pull us to that. Like, that archetypal experience of loving another is so powerful that it's potentially the only thing that can really pull us into that growth and draw out of us the most of us that we've ever been able to access before. It's just not something we would choose. If everything's going along swimmingly, we're sure not going to try to change it. It takes the crisis of the sisters planting the seed of doubt that then causes her to commit the first betrayal. Betrayal is an essential ingredient for this growth. And good Lord, anybody who's been through betrayal, which by midlife is most of us, you just would never choose that, right? You would never choose to do that to somebody consciously, and you would certainly never choose to have it done. It's awful. And yet the growth that comes through it is so essential if we can turn that suffering into something meaningful, meaning a love of soul.
It's powerful. I love how you mentioned that betrayal is an essential or a foundational aspect of this soul growth, and that is such a different way of looking at it.
Yeah, betrayal's awful, but first we have to have trust or naivete, and then the betrayal. But then on the other side of that, we get to learn forgiveness. We can never know forgiveness if we've never been betrayed. And to be able to know forgiveness is a beautiful, beautiful thing. It's, in my opinion, one of the highest experiences of love, although I don't think it's something we choose. It's quite an act of grace, and it's an archetypal experience as well. And I think it's probably also related directly to the archetypal experience of loving, right?
Yeah. So in the work that you're putting together, research that you're doing, that you've done for your book and for the upcoming course that you're going to teach, what have you found to be the challenges are perhaps more common that individuals have when it comes to romantic love that are going to be highlighted in your course?
Well, two things really stand out, and these are both depth psychological terms. One is the animus anima that I've touched on briefly. Those, in short, are intra-psychic experiences that mediate between the unconscious and the conscious personality, and they're personified. So animus as a masculine, anima as a feminine, and that shows up as strong erotic attraction towards somebody. The other part that's really important, and maybe the most difficult in terms of lived relationships, is projection. And so that's directly related to the animus experience, in that we project that divine other of the anima or animus onto the person that holds our erotic fascination. But what we're projecting is ourselves. And so that's where it becomes, projection means we see something in the other that is actually within us. So it's maybe in the other to a certain degree. In fact, it most definitely is to a certain degree, but it may be a very small degree. What we're seeing in the other is actually something in us, and it may be largely unconscious still. So this whole process of taking apart these projections of like, what is mine, what is this human's values, this person's, that is such a messy disentanglement. People are just flabbergasted that this person can be so perfect for the first 6 months or a year, just like the rose-colored glasses, and then all of a sudden, oh no, why aren't you behaving the way you did? And then we spend the next 6 years trying to get back to the first 6 months. But all of that is about the removing of projections, right? We're removing the projections, and we're really getting to know that other person who is really very different than our internal figure of that person.
So I think it's interesting that one of the ways that there's a recognition for us of what is possibly happening is that erotic charge. That's like a sign saying, this is a soul journey over here for you.
Yeah, the erotic charge for sure. Whenever there's a lot of libido or psychic energy flowing toward a person, and that excitement, and it's just such a great feeling. It's so fun when we have it, and people can actually get quite addicted to that feeling, which that becomes a problem. But that feeling of seeing ourselves in another is just so titillating. Time stands still, and everything smells better and tastes better, and we just look forward to that person, and the world is just richer and more golden, right? And that is actually all true. It's love heightens all of our senses. So it's not just projection. There also has to be an element of love with the person too. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So that differentiates it also from just being an erotic encounter that just feels really good versus the soul connection.
Right. Yeah. And we can absolutely have erotic encounters that just feel really good. That would be a expression of Aphrodite that's more spontaneous, where you just connect with somebody and that erotic charge is there, and maybe you have a wonderful affair or fling, and that is absolutely an Aphrodite experience and expression. But it's not the only one. There's other expressions with Aphrodite. Some grow slowly over time. There's different ways it manifests as well.
And so, you hear those cliched things like, I feel like I've known you forever, or I feel like we've met before, or people will say, I just like a recognition that there's just an instant knowing about this person and this relationship. And really, you are having that experience, but it's an experience of yourself. It's like a soul remembrance, right?
Totally. That's so well said. Yes. How often people have that experience. And it's a great experience to feel so seen and known. And it's true, you are seeing and knowing, but you are seeing and knowing your own self, right? And it's not that we really want to take the magic out of falling in love, because it is so magical. And I don't know that we actually could even take the magic out of falling in love. But there is also this part of what we're falling in love with does belong to us. It's our soul.
And so when we are striving to hang on, to not let go, to get back to this person, it's really wanting to get back to ourselves, or what we're seeing out there. We don't know it's really a part of us.
Really wanting to get back to ourselves, or maybe those things need to be developed as well. So they might be aspects that we maybe haven't even been able to hold consciously yet. It's just our next thing that we have to move toward, right?
So in a way, and I'm not sure what part of the myth this correlates with, so maybe you can help me with this. It's like a awakening, right? You're waking up parts of yourself, or you're becoming aware in a different way and seeing and experiencing parts of yourself differently.
Yes, absolutely. What you're awakening is soul, is psyche. Like there's a reason she goes unconscious at the end of the tale. It's because what is waking up through the struggle, through all of this, is psyche and your relationship to psyche. We often think about, and I probably have even phrased it this way because it's my kind of default way of thinking about it, as soul or psyche being something that resides within us. And I touch my heart as I say that, because it feels like it belongs to that heart place. Love and soul are so interconnected. But I actually found through my research and through my further and further reflections on it, that psyche is embodied in our bodies, but it's more like we as the conscious personality are in her. It's more like we are in psyche. So she is the one who is guiding us all along. She is the one who's dreaming us forward. We're in service to soul. As we come to love soul and recognize her presence, we become, as a conscious personality, in service to soul, which it means following love.
Wow, this is just so incredible. I love having this conversation with you about, these experiences that really, I think that for many of us, when we're in it and not conscious of what's happening, it can feel really good. You can feel like you're being swept away. Then you can feel like you're drowning. And to be able to begin to get a sense of what this process is, even though I think, I don't know, it's my experience, this would not have been something I could have done in the moment. I had to go through this, and then the awareness and the growth came later.
Absolutely. And I think something quite important about all of this love and soul piece and consciousness is the lamp represents consciousness. And it's the consciousness that causes the betrayal and the suffering. So there's something about too much consciousness in the realm of love and soul can be really detrimental to the process. And so what that can look like in lived experience is like being too analytical with it and too logos and too, oh, I know you're just my projection and I know you're my animus guide and okay, I'm going to try to follow the guide. It kind of destroys the magic of love. And so we want to be walking a taut line or holding attention of not bringing in too much consciousness too quickly, and yet also letting the love work on us and the suffering work on us in order to bring about an expanded sense of self-awareness and self-consciousness.
And when you say the lamp, and I just want to mention this for our listeners who may not remember this part of the myth we just went over, the lamp is the light that Psyche holds to see Eros's face, and that's when she spills the oil. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And logos represents the part of ourselves that is the rational part, the intellectual.
That's right. The rational, logical, intellectual, cause and effect, black and white, right? Like very not mysterious. It doesn't allow for the mystery. It's very knowable by empirical evidence type of knowledge, right? Which is also valuable.
Right.
But too much of that in the realm of love destroys the mystery and magic of love.
And so when you look at the story and then you look at lived experience, and of course we can't predict anybody's future, but what are the potentials for someone who doesn't see or doesn't step into this invitation? What happens?
Well, unfortunately, I think that's a little bit of an epidemic in culture these days, because we don't have enough ritual to actually honor the growth stage, the psychological growth stage that happens at midlife. And we kind of minimize it by calling it the midlife crisis, in much the same way we minimize the power of Eros by having it be a cute little baby in a diaper. It creates some pretty significant psychological mental health challenges. And so I think commonly people that aren't able to step into that, they're trying to anesthetize in various ways. And maybe that's through wine, hard alcohol, drugs, sex, gambling, shopping, pharmaceuticals. There's all kinds of different ways that we can try to anesthetize so we don't have to be called into this struggle. The fortunate thing, perhaps, is because relationship involves two people, if one person is engaged in the struggle, the other person inevitably has to step into it to some degree, because one person can't change without the other person being affected. So if one person's not happy, maybe they wander, the couple gets disconnected, we have affairs happen so often, usually as a result of emotional disconnect or the wish for the unlived life, these kinds of common problems that cause affairs. And so when we have that kind of crisis happen in relationship, because there's two people, now both people are in the period of individuation and being called to have to grow and expand themselves.
Yeah, this is so common. I see it as a therapist, where the struggle that they come in with externally is really not the struggle that's happening internally. There's so much attention on what's happening and how to get the person back or what I need to do differently. And I don't know if it's the part of the myth where consciousness reveals to them something, the betrayal, but they're not able to do anything more with that awareness.
Well, and I think people can get stuck there, and then I think what can happen is they maybe just loop back over and over, and they never mature. So they just stay in this kind of perpetual state of chasing one naive young maiden after another, or young Cupid after another, and never having to really grow and step into their next stage, because it's hard. And it's important, I think, each of these stages represent particular challenges of psychological growth, so that ant nature and the sorting being about what we're sorting out, and discernment, particularly internally, but also externally, like, we can, all the day-to-day stuff, that the 100,000 things or 10,000 things that we have to do in a day, that's all part of that ant nature stuff that we have to develop. most people will come into that stage. And then we'll have the second stage. And there are 3 different stages: the collecting the wool, how much masculinity is enough, how much power is enough, the collecting the water, how much of the water is enough, and how can we focus our vision to set our intention to do that. The trip to Hades and back, I don't think everybody makes that particular step. In fact, I would say probably not. And I don't think they need to. Like, I don't think everybody has to do all 4 stages, depending on the level of soulfulness or meaningfulness or type of person they are in the world. But if we are called to do that step and we don't do it, the price is usually our mental health, or what we call mental health. It's actually probably more accurately emotional health, but anyway, it shows up that way.
And then for those who are able to embark on this journey and go where it leads them, however many tasks, whether it's also to hell and back or to Hades and back, then this is a powerful catalyst for transformation.
Very powerful. It's a myth that can also be a really helpful guide, right? If we recognize, oh, this is the myth that I'm in. The other thing about these 4 tasks is they don't happen chronologically. They're laid out chronologically. They don't actually, in reality, play out chronologically. Certain ones will overlap and they'll kind of go on simultaneously through different struggles. But as we go through that process, we're further transformed by the process, the metamorphosis. This story is born out of the Apuleius story called The Metamorphosis. And it's a little like folk tale that's in the middle of this larger heroic journey story that just sort of appears out of nowhere. And so that's how it became known, was as this tale in Apuleius.
Stacey, thank you so much for sharing time with me today and your wisdom and experiences around romantic love. I think this is such a necessary conversation for the world to hear. I don't know that many of us are aware of romantic love in this way, understanding it through the lens of mythology and depth.
Well, and I think if we can make meaning of the suffering, as Jung said, it makes the suffering so much more endurable, right? We're not going to avoid the suffering, but if we can make meaning of it by going through the transformation process, it'll be infinitely more endurable.
Thank you so much, Stacey, again for being here today. We're going to make sure that we include all your information again in the show notes. And I'm very excited to share our conversation with the world in February, along with the Valentine's Day theme and all the other love-related celebrations around that month.
Well, thank you for having me, Lourdes. It's been a delight to be able to bring this depth psychological perspective on romantic love to Valentine's Day and to try to create more meaning out of relationships for people that are in the struggle.
Thanks so much and take care.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for listening to the Women in Depth podcast. I hope it brings you a deeper understanding of yourself and others, and that you found some insights that illuminated and inspired. You can follow Women in Depth on Facebook and YouTube, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe on iTunes and leave a review. And finally, if you enjoy Women in Depth, please share with a friend. Again, thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.